So we changed up the opening intro video because the other one was getting dinged by YouTube. So we're still playing around with it as we go along. So, hey, Roger, what's going on with you?
Hey, I'm doing well, Scott. How you doing?
All right.
Good. I like your opening video. It looks nice. Very nice.
Yeah. And I'm into like guitar metal. So that's just one thing I like.
Oh, you need now some drums, right?
Yeah, really, it's on that too. So, okay. So you had a, interesting thought when it comes to January 20th. And you're the one that said it originally, that he might have to go through the inauguration, have the oath, and then boom, everything kind of goes. So that was the interesting part. Were you surprised about January 6th, though, that they didn't do anything, or how did you feel about that?
I believe it went along as it was supposed to go along. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary there. I think the weather sort of helped with that, but I think at the end of the day, I think the White Hats are in control. I think they're calling the shots with this as they need to, and I think the one thing that people need to expect is the unexpected. And to whatever extent that's going to mean, expect the unexpected, because I believe January 6th went the way it was supposed to.
Right.
Even with the Carter funeral today, if you watch some of the video on that, I mean, it was interesting to see how that came along, especially with everybody honoring former presidents with a eulogy. We're going to kind of roll all these things out here, presenting everybody in the past with how good they really are before we exposed how bad they really were.
Right.
And I go back to what President Trump said. He said, they asked him if he was going to be a dictator, and he said, I will be a dictator on the first day. After that, we'll enter the golden age. So that kind of tells me a lot there with what he's anticipating.
Well, yeah, explain that one a little bit. I mean, a dictator on the first day, what does that mean?
Okay, so for example, we had the inauguration, and we go through with the speeches and everything else. We have the parade. And one of the interesting things is that probably a lot of people will not be aware of is when he goes to the president's room on the Senate side of the Capitol, he will sign his oath of office, and he will be in the midst of a lot of spectators, members of the inaugural committee. Some of them will be there, family members, members of the House and Senate. And at that point in time, once he signs his oath of office, he will have some executive orders that he signs when he's signing in there. So there may be, a handful of executive orders that he signs initially to get everything started. The bulk of those will probably be done at the White House later in the day after the parade's over with.
Okay.
And I believe when he gets to those, he is more than likely going to go back and repeal or eliminate every prior executive order that is in conflict with what he wants to do. And I think that's going to be really the first step where we'll get a sense of what to look at. The deportations will start to take place. We'll have a sense of, exactly what types of things are going to be out there. But that's going to be the kickoff. And I believe that at that point, people will feel like he's a dictator, because that could very well be the time that people get arrested. And more than likely the illegals, but there could be other people that get picked up at that point in time too. So I think that's the one thing that the unexpected that we could consider happening.
Okay, I gotcha. Sorry, I'm just moving that over here so I can see it a little bit better here. So it just doesn't want to show up in the right spot here. Okay, so when you think about what's about ready to be accomplished in here, you mentioned we're looking to review the Constitution, and you sort of have mentioned that a little bit. What do you mean by reviewing the Constitution executive orders? I mean, is that what you were talking about there? Would he be looking over those, or would he already know them?
Well, I believe he already knows that. I mean, for example, I think we're going to go through a process where we're going to have a very complex unpeeling, if you will, of what takes place. And I believe that the way the process is going to work is that we have to look at it. For example, if I'll single out executive orders. Executive orders by the president really kind of set the stage for the beginning of his presidency. He can identify the things that are critical and important to him and do those with executive orders. And he can refer to statutes, regulations, constitutional issues within those executive orders. He can set the tone for how his government is going to function. And in so doing, that means that all the research into that has been done. It's my understanding that Stephen Miller was working feverishly for the last 60 days to put together these executive orders. They knew exactly what they want to do. They know, what's going to be first, what's going to be second. It may very well be that, there's a border issue there. Either we declare the border to be impenetrable and we're going to deport everybody, or we round up everybody first and then deport them. One of those two will probably be either the second or third executive order. I
Right.
believe the first one is going to lay out the major elements of his presidency, and that will identify things such as repealing prior executive orders that conflict with the direction that he's going to go with things. There will be executive orders there that deal with a whole variety of other things, such as limiting the size of government, report to work days for federal employees, just a variety of things like that. And what I make reference to there about having to peel this back, there are some of these where you can do with an executive order. There's others that require a repeal of a statute. And I think you're starting to see some of the statutory introductions being done in the Congress. One example of that is the repeal of the ATF. There's been a bill introduced that would repeal the ATF and eliminate its funding. So you've got situations like that that are running. These are all running on parallel tracks. And so it's important for folks to look at the fact that you've got the president operating as chief executive, you've got members of Congress doing their thing in the legislative branch, and there may be opportunities where the Supreme Court is called upon to render an opinion or decision as to any conflicts that might exist as part of the checks and balances. And I think the direction we're going to see within the first several hours of the Trump presidency is we're going to see a lot of these things begin to take effect. Now, one of the interesting things is if we look at the executive orders that he signed previously that have been renewed, 13818, 13848, those executive orders are already in place, but he may renew those at that point, and he may renew those with additional criteria. And for example, one of those might be that he would give, with the renewal of the executive order, a signal, if you will, to law enforcement agencies or to the military to begin to arrest people. Now, the reason we've got the distinction between the two is that if it's clearly something that would be brought before a military tribunal, that is someone who, for example, is in the military, who turned against the country, and we know there's a lot of people like that, or a civilian who may have engaged in declaring war against the United States and engaged in manipulating the elections or stealing the elections, then that could be included within that executive order as well. So stepping that up and requiring the involvement of law enforcement and the military to begin to round these folks up. I believe when he talks about being a dictator on the first day, those are going to be some of the things that he's going to trigger from that point going forward. And once those orders are out there, I mean, we have close to, 1,020,000 sealed indictments.
Oh, yeah, right.
And with each one having up to 100 people on per sealed indictment, I mean, there could be a fairly large number of arrests where the process will start. And so, those are the types of things I believe that you'll see in the background on that first day. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Republican leadership feels as though they have to be ready to provide their president with whatever is necessary with regard to repealing certain types of barriers that stand in the way of him getting his job done.
Okay, so when you're when you're thinking about these and you're thinking about, okay, so he sets up this, he sets up the his ability to kind of do everything through the oath. He then moves forward into the Constitution, the executive orders that he needs to that give him the power to do things. Then he kind of dispenses it out to the right agencies, whatever that might be. It could be sheriffs at times, it could be military, whatever. And then we have the concept, that SCOTUS must revisit some issues. What might SCOTUS do if they're going to be a part of this as well?
Well, for example, the one thing that comes to mind is that if the president in his executive orders lays out a requirement that no agency created by a body other than the United States Congress and funded by the United States Congress shall be able to continue forward on this day. And that's probably not the best wording, but that's the general scenario. You have a situation where you have the Consumer Financial Protection Board. It was actually created by the Congress, but it's funded by the Fed. So if he comes along and says that unless the funding for the CPFB was approved by Congress and controlled by Congress, that agency is no longer in effect, it's invalid. So you might have someone like Elizabeth Warren immediately file an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, asking that that executive order be invalidated because it takes away something that was involved in legislation that she created. So that might be one example. Another example is that, again, we don't have tariffs in place. So if he decides to put tariffs in play on that day, he may conceivably, he could put an executive order together that says that we are going to delay the collection of certain taxes on that first day. And that's why I believe it's really hard to get a firm handle on what all these might be, because if I go to the issue of taxes, the 16th Amendment says that we can collect taxes on a variety of sources of income. But it says that it says the United States government shall collect those taxes. But the question becomes, does the president have the authority to defer or postpone collection of those taxes? And if a president is coming in saying, look, we are eliminating taxes on tips, for example, maybe there's an executive order that says that effective January 2025, there will no longer be taxes on tips or commissions or bonuses or whatever might be in that executive order. And again, that becomes a topic where the Supreme Court can chime in. Now, again, with that being an amendment to the Constitution where the court's going to look, and that's why it makes sense for people to understand how they would take this issue forward to the court. The Constitution is pretty clear in Article 1 and 2 about how we go about levying taxes, how we collect those resources and what those are based upon. And actually, the 16th Amendment, many believe, is in conflict with the Constitution.
Yeah.
There was a big rush to do it. And right now, what we did by going through that, we've created a constitutional question. And that is, does the 16th Amendment have the power to shift the responsibility in our federalist system from the states, like the 10th Amendment, to the federal government in the 16th Amendment, while that's in conflict with the articles of the Constitution? So again, how that question gets phrased by the court, to the court, can dictate how the court is going to interpret that particular case. And if you look at previous decisions the court has made, they sort of come back to the fact that, the government has the power to collect the taxes. And, they're not saying that it's a permanent power. They're saying that it's a power that was given to it by the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, along with that, you've had several efforts where Congress has introduced legislation that would actually create the opportunity to repeal the 16th Amendment. So then you get back to the 32-38 number, where you have to have 32 states support the amendment, and then you have to have 38 states ratify the amendment to repeal it. So those things may be going on simultaneously. And then if I can throw another element in this, if we take a look at the fact that we've had people who have stolen elections that are serving, the question then becomes, are those individuals legitimately a member of the body in which they serve, whether it be the House or the Senate?
Right.
And I'll just deal with the federal legislative structure now, because we have seen several races where they delayed the counting and flipped the winner. So the question becomes, is there another case where someone would challenge their legitimacy to be a member of the Congress or the Senate to be deciding on these issues? And should they be taken out of office? Should they be removed from office because they did not legitimately win the race?
Right.
And so when I talk about all these different things going on at one time, there's a lot of elements there that sort of need to be unpacked one by one to determine the best way to go forward. I mean, I know that repealing the IRS and doing away with taxes is a very important element of NESARA. Stolen elections are a very important element. But again, I think the process we're in is we're going to be looking at years of peeling back everything. If people do not have a valid election, if you will, and they served without legally and without properly being elected, then the oath of office they took is by fraud. Then the votes and decisions they make become invalid. So the question on that becomes, how far back do we go to invalidate all of these? And I would argue that we go back decades to get rid of this because, there's two ways we could do it. We can have the court declare these things invalid, which is going to take a long time to do, or we can introduce legislation and have it pass the Congress that declares those acts invalid. So one by one, we're passing new legislation that invalidates or repeals a law.
Well, I mean, I know that concerns people when you feel like, it's going to take time. What I want you guys to catch, what Roger is talking about, is more of the legislation, that the legislative process to repeal things. So, I know he's dealing with IRS, but you can actually put a lot of things on hold while you look into it. So, for instance, I know this. Today is the 9th of January, and I have not run my first payroll of the year. Every time we get to a new year, especially in a year where a new president is in place, I know payroll taxes take a change. And even if you have a salaried rate and you don't go up and down, I have a couple of people in that kind of realm. I'll notice that difference, and they haven't changed their deduction at all, and that's when something's been happening. So some of the NESARA stuff can happen pretty darn quickly, but other things like the dealing with elections and dealing with some of the legal issue takes a little bit more time.
Yes, and I think one of the issues that we have here is that the whole purpose of the income tax, and again, I'll focus on the income tax system for a minute here. The whole purpose of that system was to provide revenue for the government to operate. But the problem is the government became irresponsible when it came to their operations. And now they cannot collect enough money to pay the bills. Right. So the real question becomes, so if we go to this concept of raising the debt ceiling, and that's what the president wants in the reconciliation bill. So we raise the debt ceiling. Then we come back with an executive order. And this is not really a new consideration because they considered this in August of 2020, where they were looking at the potential of suspending payroll taxes.
Right.
And what impact that was going to have. So if we raise the debt ceiling, and then we come along and say we are going to suspend the following taxes, and we identify what those taxes are, then that is something that the government can do. And the president could start it off initially with an executive order, but it would be better suited to go through the Congress. Right. And the Congress and the president then can pass a law to do a suspension of these taxes, the payroll taxes, the no tax on tips, the bonuses, if you will, whatever type of element of the tax structure they want to suspend, they can do that. And then they can replace it with a different source of revenue, such as tariffs, right, if they choose to do that. So, and it makes sense when you're looking at that argument there, because then if that's a matter that goes to the court, then you can argue the fact that, number one, there are clear constitutional violations of the 16th Amendment, because if I look at prior cases, I don't think anyone's done a really good job of arguing how the 16th Amendment conflicts with the Constitution. And so if they look at a repeal and replace, which again is a process states use all the time, and the federal government has done it too, where you repeal one law that generates revenue and you replace it with another one that's going to generate revenue, but from a different source. And so those are things that could be done. Now, simultaneously, if we take a look at cutting the budgets, then we're actually reducing the amount of debt that we have by reducing these budgets. And for example, every budget that gets passed for the major departments, and the very first paragraph or two of the budget, it says the secretary is hereby empowered to spend up to 90% of the
Right.
budget to undertake activities of the department, which means they can hold back 10%. And so if you take a look at there's this whole issue with the Impoundment Act that President Nixon dealt with. If you take a look at the ability that the secretary has to withhold and not spend those funds, they're not impounding the funds. They're just withholding them and not spending them.
Right.
So there's different ways that we can use the budgetary process, the legislative process, and then the court process, SCOTUS, to deal with this. Now, if we look at something like regulations, the problem that we have with regulations, the Administrative Procedures Act, which I touched on previously, that has a requirement in there that you have to give a 90-day notice if you're going to suspend any of the regulations that are out there. And so one of the things
but hold on one second though. So 90-day suspension of a regulation, but doesn't the Chevron doctrine delete that point? Am I missing something?
Okay, that deletes that point for that particular item, but we have all these other regulations out there. So if the government itself wants to go through, for example, and repeal or rescind a lot of these regulations, they have to go through the notice of proposed rulemaking. And so they publish that. There's 90 days for an opportunity for people to comment and so forth before that becomes a final rule. So that's another tool, if you will, that's in the toolbox. And the reason I mention these things is because I believe when President Trump comes into office, he has already begun to understand and access all the tools available to him to cut the budget, to eliminate programs, to reduce taxes, to eliminate possibly down the road the IRS, to replace it with tariffs, to look at all the different things he has to do to restructure and remake government. DOGE, if you will, the Department of Government Efficiency, is just another one of those tools in the toolbox that will permit them to do that. Requiring employees to come back to work on the 21st. If they don't show up, they don't have a job. They could be deemed a voluntary quit. Changing the status of the senior executive service, which he did in his first term, and moving that back because Biden rescinded that executive order. The president can do that. And so, again, that's another tool that gives him what he needs to go forward in reducing the size of government. And the reason I'm having this discussion with this is that if I look at NACERA and everything that has to be done, it would be nice to flip on a switch and everything to happen immediately. But the Supreme Court has said that if we're going to make changes to the structure of our government, we have to work within the Constitution and laws that we have and the process, the powers that each branch of government has. So there is a way that we can do this and make it very active going forward. And that's why I say that if all these different things come into play, I think you'll see a very active first 90 days, 6 months as they're going through the process of dismantling all of this.
Right. Okay. So now let's kind of flip over into what the role of government within election duties might be, because you kind of talk a little bit about that in different ways. What is the role in that way?
So the way our Constitution is structured, we have to provide for the election, and again, I'll focus this on the federal level. We have to provide for the election of representatives to the House of Representatives, and then by amendment, the election of senators to the Senate. And so that responsibility is placed upon states to be able to do that. So there's varying processes they can go through. They can have open primaries, they can have closed primaries, they can have caucuses, which is a gathering of the people in the political party that are selecting their candidates for a primary election. They can require a filing fee. They can require signatures on petitions. There's a whole variety of things that come into play. So once the people decide they want to run for office and they're going to submit either the registration fee, the signatures, go through the caucus process, whatever it is, to be identified as a potential candidate for the primary election. It's up to the states to make certain that those elections are held in a legal process. And that legal process means one person, one vote, and it means being able to prove identity, that you're a citizen of the United States, because after all, citizens are the only ones that can vote. And so you have these states that have come along and manipulated the process and actually undermined the electoral process by changing how this works and saying, well, you don't need to prove citizenship. It used to be you had to have an address, and then they expanded it to be a gas or utility bill to be able to qualify to vote. And now they just say, just fill out the form and you can vote. So they essentially have watered down the process for elections. And what that's done is that's had a negative impact on the people that are elected in the Senate and the House. And so what we have to do is we have to take a look at that process, and we have to correct it and make certain that it's uniform across the states, that the people who are entitled to vote, vote, and those who are not are declared ineligible to vote.
Right.
And the reason I say that is because some states say that if you're a convicted felon, you can't vote. Others say if you don't register, you can't vote. They've gone with same-day registration in a lot of states. That they've gone with the Motor Voter Act, which permits you the opportunity to register when you get your driver's license. So there's a lot of different elements there that they have to look at. But the most important element is the state is responsible for overseeing the elections. And the states, usually the Secretary of State's office or Director of Elections, they will then rely on county clerks or county election officials to monitor that at a county level, and then you've got your city and township people that will monitor it at that lower level to make certain that the voting is done correctly. And what we have in our country is we have evidence going back to 2018 and before of stolen elections and votes being manipulated and people being put in office that were neither entitled to be in office because they didn't have enough votes, or they engaged in criminal activity to get fake votes, if you will, or to manipulate the process. And so, again, what we have to do is because it's my understanding that the powers that be, the military, has all the evidence of the vote switching that's taken place going back at least 10 years. And so at that point in time, then they have the opportunity to identify which election was stolen, which race was stolen, who the people are. Those then become the perpetrators who, if they took office inappropriately, then anything they did to support a bill in the Congress or the state houses or even locally is invalid because they never had a valid election to put them in office. And so, again, that becomes another part of the unwinding. So as we look at unwinding some of the bills, we might find out we don't have to unwind the bills because we might have, for example, a Congress that was invalid because most of the members never won their election. And that's what the Brunson case gets at, because if you're not validly elected, you can't take an oath. And if you can't take an oath and not be validly elected, then anything you do in that body is invalid. It's void. So that's as though it never happened. So that's another parallel track that we're on to try and peel back and separate all the activities that took place. And those things, like I said, when you put these all together, these are going to take place over a period of time. And it's going to require patience of the American people as we're going through this to watch all these things unwind. But the people who committed the crimes to steal elections, to steal the votes, to flip the elections, to flip the seats, those people actually are engaging as though they've declared a war against the United States. They are trying to create a revolution to overthrow the government. So therefore, those people find themselves in that unique category of where they've engaged in that behavior, being subject to arrest and being one of those folks that appear on the sealed indictments.
Right. Well, and it leans you, and which you kind of made the point before, is, that person is in level of treason. And it's a pretty scary situation for them because right there, that's a death penalty.
Yes. And again, in those kinds of situations, it is a death penalty, but if they can turn on somebody above them, they may be able to extend it to life. But my underlying purpose in pulling these all together is to demonstrate that this, merely because we get President Trump in office on January 20th, I do not believe things are going to instantly be great the next day. We're going to have a long process to go through to try and fix all the problems that are there. And there's so many other elements there when you talk about the departments on the federal level. You talk about the budget, you talk about the members of Congress, you talk about staff, you talk about all the other shenanigans and misbehavior they've been up to. There's just so many things there. And then the question becomes, what happens if we see the size of the Congress reduced because of people who got in by stealing elections?
Right.
Then the question becomes, if we're looking at repealing these, we're more than likely going to have fewer votes necessary to repeal them. But by the same token, we can move that process forward. And then the question becomes, if we look at taking some of these very same folks out in the state and there's new elections to replace them with all the other hanky-panky that's going on, it's very possible we get up to those 32 votes to say repeal the 16th Amendment and repeal other amendments that they don't like, and the 38 votes to ratify that. In other words, we may see the colors in the country go from blue to red.
Right.
Because
almost overnight.
Almost overnight, yes. And so, in a roundabout way, when you sit here and look at this, there is a tremendous amount of activity that needs to take place to be able to move us back to the point of where we need to be with our republic form of government. Now, we call our government a federal system because we look at each state as having equal power under our Constitution. And so it's like the Confederacy. It was a collection of states. And so they all come together and vote as individual states to have a say in what the government's going to be. But we've moved away from that. We've delegated that to the federal government and given the federal government the opportunity to have complete control in our daily lives over everything from taxes to water to electricity to owning our homes to everything else. And so it's important that we begin to unpack that and take it apart. And more than likely, it's going to take a period of time and probably a couple of elections before we get this done. And I know that's hard for people to hear if they've been hoping that this was going to be instantaneous. But if we have the court saying we need to follow our process, we have to follow our process.
Right. But I think, okay, so again, what Roger's talking about is the legal area of dealing with how things run. Okay. So, you're talking about, in essence, if we were just used it as a football team or a hockey team, just not having good players isn't your only problem. Okay. You have to have good players, but you also have to have good management. And so in essence, what Roger's talking about is the management of the systems that have to be fixed. Now, instantaneously, there are some things that can easily flip pretty quickly. That a gold-backed currency, when it moves in, it basically eliminates so many things that will shock people in seconds almost. And I think that's what the quantum financial system's about. That's what the foundation of deleting the Fed will be. And once you see that starts stripping away all the powers of the elite idiots out there who've been doing it. Then you have to take away their legal rights to jump back into the game, in essence. Wouldn't that be the case maybe you're talking about?
Yes, that's correct. And so what we do, for example, if we look at, for example, gold-backed security, the RV, if we look at the quantum financial system, that right there takes away so many elements of problems that we have today. I mean, it addresses the bank issue, it addresses the mortgage issue, it addresses the value of money, it takes care of the inflation issue, it knocks out the Fed, it takes away the power that people have exercised over everybody else. Mortgages are gone. Car loans.
It deals with the debt. Deals with all of those things. That can be done like almost an instantaneous process. But again, what you're talking about is you've got to fix the end roots that they have created. Is that another way of saying it?
Yes, that is, because see, once we, okay, so for example, once we get this done, we have to make certain that we're not going to have a group like, say, the Fed, which we would eliminate, or the CPFB come back and say, we're now going to institute these new policies. So that almost has to be done simultaneously, because if you remove the overseer of the problem and you eliminate the problem, then you've resolved the issue. And so by getting rid of the federal agencies that oversee these things, it puts us in a much better position to say we've dealt with that once and for all, and now we can move forward to some of the other issues.
Right.
And so that's
a beautiful way of putting it, because again, they keep trying to legislate different points, and yet you go, your eyes look at that situation and go, my gosh, it's a lot simpler than we think it is. And frankly, it is.
Yes.
You have to see that. But again, you've got to deal with all the legal mumbo jumbo on the side of this stuff to make sure that those guys, new guys don't show up and start, trying to take advantage.
Yes, we need to make certain that, if you will, the disease is completely eradicated, and there's absolutely no trace of it left. And that's why it's important to go through the process and address the issues with regards to the laws, the regulations, and the orders, and make certain that we have a Supreme Court that's on our side that says, yes, this is the way it has to be done. Because every federal branch of government, the executive, the Congress, and the courts, have moved away from their original constitutional mandate. And they have allowed other types of agencies to be created to step in and take over those responsibilities. And one of the nice things about the elimination of the Chevron doctrine was that Congress needs to be very specific about what they want going forward.
Right.
And so if Congress says we're going to eliminate the ATF, period, then the government's out of the business of regulating firearms.
Right.
And then, and that's one example. And you sit here and take a look again at the enforcement powers. If we go through and change the FBI around and we eliminate what the FBI stands for, and we send the law enforcement folks back to the local communities to help engage with the situations at the local level, that makes perfect sense. And I hearken back to an interview that was done by Milton Friedman back in the 90s. And he was asked the question, if we take a look at the federal government and the federal agencies, how many would you say we would end up with if we were to eliminate the ones that are totally unnecessary? He would say maybe 6 or less. And again, defense being one of those. And you sit here and you look at, even with our court system, do we need a Department of Justice? We might in some areas, but that might be phased out as well. Do we need a Treasury Department? Well, it depends on how strong the Treasury Departments of the states are. And the Treasury Department could be crafted into performing a different function. So we have to be creative. And that's why I believe if we sit here and take a look at the resources this country has, we have an opportunity to grow into that creative mindset, to be able to craft our government the way the original founders of the Constitution intended, and move away from all this gibberish that's been created by self-serving individuals.
Right. It's funny. I went to a Doge meeting, and it was like almost 400 or 500, well, several hundred people that showed up at, and it was in Oklahoma City, and it was real funny because I think we were on the 3rd floor, and so we were right around this area, so they had several state senators and other people talking. And I watched, now Senate was just in session. I mean, the House and Senate of the state was just in session. And I saw several of them, because they're all dressed up with suits on, and they would look over the side and they're looking down at us going, wow, that's a lot of people showing up. And it was kind of interesting to watch the reaction of it. And I think most of these people have never seen when the people rise up. And when the people have risen up as they've done, they're terrified. And so I'm gonna give you a little story, and you can jump in here after that. But I was given the story by a gentleman, and I can't share with what state he's in. And just a business owner, and he just gets some of the most amazing people. And when I was talking to him, he said, yeah, I have a guy who is super deep inside of one of the departments. And in that department, he said, I know where all the money is going. And he goes, really? I mean, you don't sound like you would know where everything is going systemically. He said, yeah, I do. I know down deep where that money goes. And he said his statement was, everyone in DC is absolutely terrified. They know a change is coming. And we're not just talking about, good MAGA stuff. They know something, is groundbreaking, ripping them to shreds is coming. And yet that is also coming on a state level, because you got to deal with that as well too.
Yes, that is correct. And I agree with that statement. I have, in a previous part of my professional life, worked for a state government agency. And one of the functions I had was to work with the budget process. And so they became very adept at where they would tuck money, and they would create programs that they knew the programs would never evolve into a completed project, and they would park the money. And the reason they did that is because if the governor come along and said, or the legislature come along and said, well, we're not going to be able to give you this much money this year because tax revenues are off. We've got a change in the economy. People are out of work, whatever the rationale might be. We're going to ask you to give up money. And so they already had money there they could give up. They could say, oh, we'll cut that. That's not a problem. Or they would have unfilled full-time equivalents for employees.
Yeah.
And they could say, oh, yeah, we can give you 6 employees if you need it. And you multiply that across various state departments. That's a lot of money. You look at the federal government, the same thing is happening. And what's interesting is if you sit here and look at lawyers and lobbyists who are working the process, representing corporations, nonprofits, NGOs, all these different groups out there, they know where it's buried too. And so the big fear is that they will be taken care of by the government employees if they're in a position where they protect the agency.
Right.
Now, when the agencies are exposed because of power from the people, and they are pushing this forward, and they're making the members of the legislative body decide, how do we cut these budgets? What do we look at? What's unnecessary? What's waste, fraud, and abuse? How do we deal with this? Then they will talk to staff. The staff will talk to the people on the inside, the attorneys, the lobbyists, and the employees of the bureaucracy, and they'll figure out how much can they give back without it hurting? How much can they give up without it creating a problem? How many employees? What types of programs? They can tell you, every department can tell you what's a duplicative process, what's a wasteful process, how much abuse is going on. In another part of my career, I had an opportunity to work for a federal government agency. And that agency, I was amazed because they would get down to August to September. And this was back in the days where they collected office supplies. And they would say, we've got $20,000 remaining in our budget, so let's go out and buy office supplies.
Right.
And they had entire floors that were stocked with office supplies that were unnecessary. They would purchase equipment that was unnecessary. They would acquire buildings. They would do whatever they needed to protect that money so it didn't get turned back, because the belief was, if you turn it back this year, they're going to give you less next year.
Right.
And if you have to turn in less next year, you get less the year after. So there's this mentality within the bureaucracy that dictates how people behave. Another element of that, if you look at some of these agencies, federal agencies will give money to states. And states will say, we're not going to spend the money, we'll hold on to it. And so the federal agencies say, you have to spend this money within 3, 4, or 5 years, or it comes back to us. When the money comes back to the federal government, it gets reprogrammed and it may go into a different area. Yeah. But when you've got Congress with wide latitude on how they deal with the budget, and we've never actually had a budget for a number of years, probably 20 years.
Correct. Yeah.
And so if you go through this process referred to as reconciliation, that's going to be a process whereby agencies are forced to account for what they need and identify what they spend and what's important or not important. And even if we go back to the days of Jimmy Carter and we go back to that period of time, people were talking about zero-based budgeting, which meant that you start the year off with $0, and you have to build in justification for every program you have to grow your budget. And if you had the right justification there and you grew your budget, then you got funded. If you didn't have the justification, you didn't get funded. Well, what the Congress suddenly realized is that the minute they start doing that, they're not going to need all the money they collect. And so that became sort of an antithesis to the Congress to move that process forward. So they always stayed away from zero-based budgeting at the federal level. Some states have done it, and it's worked well. But over time, you always move away from that process, because once government gets the funds coming through the door, they're not going to give them up very easily. They're always going to find another purpose, whether they give it away in block grants, whether they give it away to people to keep them from working, whether they increase benefits to people who choose not to work or lose their jobs, or whether they just give it away for the sake of giving it away. That's the danger we live in today. And that's one of the reasons why we look at all the different things that have to be done to fix government. There is so much of it. And yes, the elected officials, senators, legislators, they are scared to death, because they know that their very livelihood is dependent on being able to respond positively to their constituents and moving this forward. The Doge process scares them because they have friends and colleagues in departments. They know when they get out of the legislature, there's a potential job as a lobbyist or a department person or working for the government. So they've got to make certain that they play on the straight and narrow with their constituents. And for many of them, it's a tough call to make.
Well, and I mean, so I will say this. I was talking to my chiropractor who's really awakened as well. And we were talking about, budget and how it really works. And I was telling him, he was given a, kind of a doomsday scenario point. And I said, listen, Sean, the point that really happens in here is that America is acting like this. It's like your son comes to you. He makes $35,000, but he's been living on $100,000 a year, and that's the calculation I did. We're somewhere close to that kind of thing. They're so far over that there's no way to run this back, even if you fix all the budget needs and in that circumstance with that through the Doge. You can't fix that one and say we're ready to roll, because the debt is sitting over here that is still, it's growing exponentially. And that's been the problem for the last 4 years since, idiot Biden and all the systems have happened, which has kind of led me to a concept that we needed to see a full term of the lunacy so that people realize we can't live this way anymore. And there is a point where you have a point of no return. I would have thought we got there a long time ago, but obviously we're not.
Well, I believe we had to go through this process for people to see, for people to understand. And the reality of the debt is, if we listen to all these numbers that get tossed around, we owe money here that, this country is invested in our treasury notes, and so we have an obligation to them, or this another country we've sent money to, all the money that's gone to the Ukraine. And the real issue becomes they're taking future earnings and giving it away.
Right.
But here's the question. What if it's not given away? What if we go to a revaluation and all of a sudden the debt that we have there is not the debt that really exists? What if we have a process whereby the countries now, because of items we've given them, they now owe us back for that investment because of the revaluation, and they have the money to repay our debt just like we have money to repay theirs? What if we get to the process whereby the debt that was created through illegal conduct and activity is wiped out? Right. And that's under NACERA. What if we get to the point of where the money the banks were involved in taking through mortgages, through loans, and a variety of other things is wiped out? That's going to reduce our debt even more. And then if we take a look at the fact that some of the people that had bad money or that took advantage of folks to make their money, drug money, what have you, all of that money is taken out. I mean, we sit here and we go through this readjustment period to where all of a sudden we're at a point where we have greater equality through our system, and we've gotten rid of the bad government stuff over there that's created the issue for us. And I think that's what NACERA seeks to accomplish. It's just that we might have to come at it from a variety of different perspectives.
Right.
And again, I think that if we look at the comparison of someone who has a job worth $35,000 who has a lifestyle of $100,000, maybe those adjust over time because we find out that everything is not as costly as it used to be.
Right.
One of the things President Trump referenced is that we were going to be going back to a period similar to the mid-1950s, where if we look at prices have come down a lot. And that drops individuals' expectation of a standard of living, because if you're making, let's say, your salary is adjusted to where you make $50,000 a year, but then your total expenses for living the lifestyle you want are at 40, then you've got 10 left over because the cost of everything you've been spending money on comes down. And that's why I believe if we look at this, there are a lot of different moving parts in here that makes this work and comes together. And I believe that's the direction we're going with this.
Okay. Well, I'm going to bring this up here.
An internal memo from the Veterans Administration surfaced containing.
I want you to listen to this and see if you can respond to it, because it's related to what we're talking about here. I was fascinated to see this and thought you might have a viewpoint of it.
Unusual request So can you just talk a minute about this being typical or not typical within the VA, them doing these sorts of things for the past few inaugurations?
What concerned me was that this has never been requested before, especially not from HHS. What we have, what I saw to me was a little bit unnerving. I've been in the VA for several inaugurations, and this was the first time they have ever asked for DEMS personnel.
First time they've ever asked for personnel.
For an inauguration, yes.
Why do you think that is?
I have no idea. That's why I decided to send that memo to you, because I believe that there's something unnerving about it. I'm not 100% sure, but my gut says this is not normal, and it's not.
The memo details a formal request from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, or ASPR. It calls upon the Veterans Administration to provide critical medical support for the event. Specifically, they sought the deployment of paramedics, registered nurses with expertise in emergency and medical surgical care, and licensed medical practitioners, including MDs, DOs, NPs, PAs, specializing in emergency medicine. The memo is signed by Derek Justad.
So, I mean, here's, as we move up toward that, we have, the VA being told through HHS, you need to provide this for the time frame of the inauguration. Why do you think that might occur there, or what do you think's going on?
Can I give you a little bit of history on this? If we go back to the very first inauguration that took place, the armed forces were the ones that were involved in establishing an AFIC, which is an Armed Forces Inaugural Committee. And they dictated the types of protection that we would have for our president. So they escorted President Washington to his inauguration, and they were there overseeing the whole process. And what's interesting is that every 4 years, the Armed Forces Inaugural Committee meets a year before the inauguration, and they go through a process of identifying what the needs might be. And over time, what they've done is they've expanded that. What they discovered and they actually had a government administrative office report in 1987, which focused on the fact that they needed to move the protections that they offered the president around the inauguration to a greater level of coordinating amongst the department agencies. And so what they did is, they had that report come out, and then they started a process every year after that, in usually January, February, the year before the inauguration, pulling all these different agencies together, trying to coordinate the programs and identify what the needs might be. And that's where they came up with requirements for, the National Guard or other people that would participate. That's where they identified the layout of the Capitol grounds and, where people sit and so forth. Well, what's interesting, they had the report all put together, what they needed. And then on January 6, 2021, we had that activity take place. And 2 days after that, they revised the requirement for the inauguration. But yet, if you watch the inauguration, a lot of things took place. There would never have been a need for some of the emergency medical personnel there because it was just something they were planning for. But they never announced that the Veterans Administration would be providing that staff. If we look at this year, based on what I've been able to discover on the research that I've done with this, is that their concern is that based upon what's taken place over the past couple of years under the Biden residency, they are concerned that there's going to be other activity that takes place around the inauguration. And the inauguration event runs 4 days before, 5 days before to 4 days after. So we have this 9-day period centered around January 20th, where we have to have resources available in the event something were to take place. And so what they've tried to do with this is they've tried to put out a call for some of those extra types of services which they didn't have, or they did not believe that they would have a sufficient number of. They would use military people, for example, with the National Guard that might have those services beforehand. But the belief is that there might be some other activity that's going to take place, so they want to make certain that they have all their bases covered. And I'm not sure that I would say it's anything nefarious that is going on here. It's just more of preparedness that's taking place.
Well, and that's what it kind of feels like. It's we're prepared. It seems like, no, this just seems like we're more prepared for something dramatic to occur in level of, I mean, I can easily see a scenario where, people are, in essence fainting over, wait a second, something real is occurring here. I don't know. There could be a lot of possibilities there.
Yes, I think there are. And I think in addition to that, previously in 2021, there was the reliance, especially around the period of January 6th, there was a reliance on DC police, DC resources, the FBI and others. And based upon what we know today, they were not prepared to handle what had to be done, and they went in the opposite direction. They actually created more problems than they did benefit. And so what they've done now is they've made it this coordinated effort so that they have multiple agencies there. They're going to have 8,000 National Guard there that they've invited in that have been deployed from the states to be there for that. I don't ever recall a number being that high for an inauguration. So they just want to take whatever precaution they can to make certain that nothing happens. And again, my personal opinion is, given the fact that President Trump is going to be inaugurated again for another term, I believe that they're of the mindset that we can't let anything happen to this because we will lose our country if we are not prepared to preserve and protect what's there. And I think that's probably one of the overlying reasons for it. I understand if you've never seen this before or you're new to it, you might wonder about it. But if you go back and read some of the documentation they put together for every inaugural committee that they've had these meetings and conversations because they wanted to coordinate it and make certain that they had whatever they needed for that event to take place.
Okay. That's interesting. Well, guys, that hopefully gives you some idea. Again, what I would say is what Roger's trying to share with you is, number one, the legal part of the process, the fixing of the mechanisms will take time. That is not going to be like overnight. The financial part kind of stuff, that I think is going to be a pretty quick issue, but it's to make sure that the idiots some new idiot doesn't come in and utilize the mechanisms to get in there and start corrupting it again. Would that make sense for you?
Yes, that would. And I think the important part is that the inauguration is such a critical, exciting moment for us. We want everything to happen and work the way it should. But I want to caution people not to be let down if it doesn't happen within a quick period of time, because there are activities going on behind the scenes. And I tried to mention some of those today. I think it's a process whereby we have to be on guard. We have to continuously evaluate and take a look at what's taking place. And we have to take advantage of the opportunities that are there. If you have a local meeting, for example, of a Doge committee, or you have people that are trying to gather input or information about your thoughts and ideas, please engage. Let them know what your thoughts are, because that's the process that we need to move forward to, is a more active involvement in our government. We've become I think we've become a little passive in the past over how we did this, and we certainly have paid the price. And so I would encourage folks to pay attention to the extent that they can. There's a lot of resources online that can point you to meeting times and dates of different functions. Learn how to use those, learn how to show up, ask questions, ask for information. They might be surprised at first if you show up, but if you engage with them, many of them are going to say, where have you been? We could have used your input earlier. There will be others that are reluctant because they don't want to lose that control. But again, our government requires input from us at all levels of government.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Roger. I appreciate it a bunch.
Oh, you're welcome.
And we will explain a lot more as we go along. Thanks so much.
Thank you.